Hi everyone, Victor here again, and in today's lesson, we'll be learning about one of the Kubernetes components called service. In our previous lesson, we learned how to use adhoc to create pod, and we also deployed a basic Nginx application. However, we could only connect to this containerized application, or rather to this pod, by having to log in into the worker node where the pod resides, and in our case, the Minikube node, before we were able to access the application. And at the end of the lesson, I mentioned that it doesn't make any sense to have to log in into the node before an application can be accessed. Hence, they need to create a service. And in our first lesson, we already talked about what a service is. And just to summarize, a service is one of the Kubernetes components that gives you access into a pod via an IP address. It will always be via IP addresses and ports. And, and Kubernetes service is not ephemeral in nature. That is, a service doesn't die, or as some gangsters will say, doesn't go down easily unlike pod. There are two types of services. We have the internal service and we also have the external service. Now let's talk about the internal service. The internal service is used for internal communication within the cluster and doesn't expose ports or application to the external or outside world. It's good to use this type of service if you don't want your applications, especially databases, to be exposed to the outside world. And the internal service is called the cluster IP. The cluster IP will be attached to a deployment at the point of creation, and this IP will automatically be generated by Kubernetes. So let's say you created a deployment which has 3 replicas of a pod. Instead of having to query just one single pod, the cluster IP can be created. Hence, you can direct your request or query to the cluster IP, and the cluster IP will forward the request to any of the pods and also does the load balancing among the pods. It can forward the request to the less busy pod, and this is one of the automated and load balancing features of Kubernetes services. So let's see this in practical. I'm going to verify the number of deployments and pod I have on this node. So I can just do that by saying kubectl get deployment. So you can see that I have just one deployment, which is Nginx app, and I have 3 ports here in this cluster. So if I do kubectl get ports, you can see that we have 3 ports that are currently running. And what I'm going to do is to query any of the pod because they are replicas from just one deployment. So I can query any of the pod. And to do that, I need to get the Minikube IP. So I can say SSH docker at 192.168.39.238. So this is going to be TC user. So you can see now that I am on the Minikube node, and now I can query any of the pods. So I can say call, oops, so we didn't get the IP address of the pod. So I'm just going to exit here and I'm going to go and get the IP address of the pod. So I'm just going to put this output to a wide option. So now I can say SSH docker this IP TC user. Now I'm inside the Minikube node, so I can say call 172.17.0.4. Oops, call. So you can see that I am getting an output. If I also do that on .3, you can see that I am also getting an output. All right, so now we need to create an internal IP, an internal service rather, which is the cluster IP. Before I do that, let's even see if we have services that are currently running in this cluster. So I can just say kubectl get service. So you can see that we have the default service. So this is the Kubernetes default service, and its type is a cluster IP, and you can also see the IP here. So we haven't created any of our services here. So what we're going to do now is to create an internal service, and to do that, we are going to expose our deployment to this internal service. So I'm just going to say kubectl expose deployment, and the name of the deployment is Nginx app, and I'm going to say port, you should expose it using this port 8080, and the target port equals 80. So by default Nginx uses port 80. So I'm saying that I want to expose this deployment to port 8080 through the default Nginx port, which is port 80. So I'm going to say enter, and now you can see that this service has been created, meaning that this deployment has been exposed. So if I say kubectl get service again, you can see now that we have a service called Nginx app, and the service type is an internal service, which is the cluster IP, and you can see that we have this IP. You can also see the port 8080 here. And from our external client, which is our VM, if we try to connect to this app, we shouldn't be able to connect because, like I mentioned, internal service is used within the cluster and it is not exposed to the outside world. So if I say call 10.101.196.221 and I use port 8080, so you can see that I cannot connect. So for me to be able to connect, I also need to log in back into the Minikube node. So that's going to be Minikube IP. So SSH 192.168.39.238. Oops, SSH Docker TC user. So now if I run the same call command 10.101.196.221 port 8080, so you can see now that I can connect. And more so, the request we're getting is from one of the ports, meaning that the service is load balancing request among the ports. To get more information about your service, you can just do kubectl get service Nginx app. Oh, sorry, I mean describe service. This will give me more information about the service. So you can see the name of the service. You can see that it is running in a default namespace. You can see the labels, the selector, and the type of service, which is the cluster IP. You can see the IP families. You can see the port. You can see the target port. And so for you to be able to get information about a resource like we summarized in our previous lesson, you can just make use of the describe option. Having understood this, let's understand the second type of service, which is the external service. The external service is used for external communication and it exposes pod or applications to the external or outside world. Of course, your web applications need to be exposed to the outside world so it can be accessible by the users. Hence, you can create an external service for this use case, And there are two types of external service. We have the option to create the node port, and we also have the option to create the load balancer. The node port external service opens an application to the outside world through the node the pod resides in, and that's why it is called node port. So when a deployment is being exposed through a node port, one will have to access an application by using the node IP and a port. So let's go practical. I'm going to delete the first internal service that we created. So I'm going to say kubectl delete service nginx app. So if I say kubectl get service, you can see that we don't have any service here anymore. To create a node port external service, you use the command kubectl expose deployment. So this is going to be nginx app, and we're going to say the type of external service is going to be node port, and we're going to expose the default port that nginx uses, which is port 80. So you can see now that this service has been created. So when I do kubectl get service, so you can see that we have a service type, which is a node port, and you can also see the cluster IP. And just like I said that we can always access this service externally, we can always access the application externally. So let's test that. So to do that, I'm going to say minikube IP. Don't forget that this application is running on the minikube node. So we need to get the minikube IP to be able to access this application externally. So from this my VM or if you're using a physical node, whichever one. So this is the external server to this minikube. So I can just say call 192 192.168.39.238, and you can see here when you check here, you can see that port 8080 is being exposed to a random port. You can actually set a port in which you want port 8080 to be exposed to externally, but because we will just do that later. I want to take this step by step, so we'll just make do of the random port that Kubernetes or that the external service has given to us. So I'm just going to say 31060. So you can see now that I can connect to this application externally. You can see that I have my welcome to nginx node. And what we can also do is to do this using the web interface. So on the web interface, I can just paste the IP and the port here. And you can see that we have this welcome to nginx node as well. Going forward, let's create the load balancer external service. So I'm going to delete this node port external service first. So I'm going to say kubectl delete service nginx app. So now that we've been able to delete this service, I'm going to create the load balancer external service. So to do that, I'm going to say kubectl expose deployment nginx app. The type of service is going to be load balancer, and of course it's going to be exposed. The port 80 is going to be exposed to the load balancer external service. Well, we have an issue here. Oops, load balancer. All right, so the service has been created. So if I do kubectl get service, so you can see now that the type of service is load balancer. And you can see here that we have external IP to be pending. And it is pending because we are not making use of a cloud service provider. This deployment is happening on premise, and this is also Minikube. So if we were using a cloud service provider rather, the IP address would have shown here, would have been given the IP address that will be able to load balance all the ports in the cluster. And when you connect to that same IP address, like I have explained, you can always connect to any of the ports. So this is how you are going to create services in Kubernetes cluster. This is one of the basic networking technology in Kubernetes. So I want to say thank you for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. When you do that, you would encourage us to do more. And also, I will see you in the next lesson. Bye for now.